There is a building on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan that most people walk past without a second glance. Its curved brown facade earned it a nickname decades ago, the Lipstick Building, because someone thought it resembled a tube of lipstick standing on end. For years it housed law firms, financial companies, the ordinary machinery of Midtown business. But on one particular floor, something extraordinary was happening. Or rather, something extraordinary was pretending to happen. The 17th floor. Upstairs, on the 18th and 19th floors, sat a legitimate business. Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities was a real market maker, a company that genuinely bought and sold stock, that employed traders and processed transactions that actually existed. That operation was visible, audited in its own way, wired into the real currents of Wall Street. If you had wandered through it, you would have seen the everyday texture of finance, screens flickering with prices, phones ringing, orders moving. But the 17th floor was different. The 17th floor was walled off. Access was restricted. The people who worked there answered to a different logic entirely, and most of the employees in the legitimate business above had little idea what was really going on beneath their feet. It was a floor built to keep secrets, and the secret it kept would eventually become the largest financial fraud in history. Because on that floor, an operation that claimed to be managing billions of dollars in investments, an operation reporting steady, almost supernatural returns to thousands of clients across the world, was not trading at all. Let that sit for a moment. This was supposedly one of the most active investment operations on the planet. On paper, it was moving money in and out of stocks and options with a precision that made its clients rich and kept them loyal for decades. The account statements arrived like clockwork. They listed trades, prices, dates, quantities, everything you would expect from a serious professional firm handling serious money. And nearly all of it was invented. No shares changed hands. No options were bought. The trades printed on those statements had never occurred. What existed instead was a small team of loyal employees, sitting at computers, generating documents. Fabricated confirmations. Manufactured histories. Records engineered to look exactly like the output of a thriving trading desk, backdated when convenient, tuned to produce whatever return the client had been promised. The 17th floor was, in the most literal sense, a factory of fiction, a place where reality was printed on demand. By the time it all collapsed, the statements sent to investors claimed a total value of around $65 billion. $65 billion. A number so large it stops meaning anything. The kind of figure that belongs to national budgets, not to a single man running a scheme from a walled-off floor in a Manhattan office tower. And here is the paradox that sits at the center of this entire story. An operation this hollow, an operation with no real trades, no genuine engine beneath it, nothing but paper and confidence, should not have survived. It should have been caught. In fact, it very nearly was, again and again. Over the years, people looked closely at the numbers Madoff was reporting and understood immediately that they were impossible. Warnings were written. Complaints were filed. Investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission came through the door more than once, asking questions that pointed straight at the truth. Yet every time, the fraud walked away untouched. The stage floor held. The fabricated statements held. The lie survived scrutiny that should have destroyed it. So the question this documentary is built around is not simply how Bernie Madoff stole from the wealthy and the trusting, though he did, on a scale that ruined lives and swallowed the savings of charities, retirees, and entire families. The deeper question is this: how does an operation this empty pass inspection? How do you show government examiners a business that does not exist and send them home satisfied? How do warnings from people who saw the whole thing coming get filed away and forgotten? To understand that, we have to go back onto the 17th floor. We have to examine the machinery of the illusion itself, the documents, the loyalists, and the carefully maintained performance of a firm that was, at its core, a building that lied. The lie began with paper, and the paper began with a machine that most of Wall Street had already forgotten. On the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building sat an aging IBM AS/400, a computer several generations behind what a firm managing billions should have been running. That obsolescence was not an accident. This dinosaur was the beating heart of the fraud, a device dedicated almost entirely to the manufacture of trades that never happened. Here is how the illusion worked. A client's monthly statement was supposed to reflect real market activity, purchases, sales, dividends, the ordinary rhythm of money at work. But nothing was being bought or sold. Instead, the staff began at the end and worked backward. They knew what return they wanted to show. Then they went hunting through historical price data, choosing days when a particular stock had risen or fallen in just the right way, and inserted those trades into a client's account as though they had been made in real time. The trade dates were fictional. The prices were cherry-picked from the past. The gains were manufactured to look impressive, but not so spectacular that they invited scrutiny. It was fiction dressed in the exact costume of fact. The AS/400 took these fabricated inputs and produced documents of remarkable polish. Confirmation slips, monthly statements, records showing securities that had never been purchased, held in accounts that contained no such holdings. Everything looked professional. Everything carried the weight of an established institution. And everything was invented. Two people stood at the center of this daily forgery. Frank D. Pasquale functioned as the operational engine of the fraud, the man who understood how the numbers had to be shaped and who directed the process by which false returns were reverse-engineered into believable records. When a client wanted a particular outcome, or when a statement needed to reflect a target that had already been promised, D. Pasquale knew how to make the machine tell that story. He was fluent in a language of deception that had its own internal logic, its own consistency, maintained year after year. Alongside him worked Annette Bongiorno, a longtime employee whose loyalty stretched back decades. She managed accounts for many of the earliest and most trusted investors, and she too knew how to produce the paperwork on demand, generating statements, arranging figures, keeping the fiction seamless for the clients under her care. Neither of these figures acted alone, and neither operated in the open. They were part of a small, insulated team whose entire job was to sustain a reality that did not exist outside their office walls. And this is the detail that makes the whole scheme so difficult to grasp. The fraud was physically separated from the legitimate business that gave it cover. 2 floors up, on the 19th floor, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities ran a genuine, respected market-making operation. That business was real. It executed real trades, employed real traders, and enjoyed a sterling reputation in the industry. Madoff himself had helped shape modern electronic trading, and that legitimacy was worth more than any forged document could ever be. It was the halo that made people trust everything else. But the advisory business, the one holding tens of billions in supposed client assets, lived below, on the 17th floor, walled off both physically and digitally. The systems did not connect. The staff did not mix. Employees on the 19th floor often had no idea what was truly happening beneath them. This split architecture was the genius and the cruelty of the design. It meant that almost no one could see the entire picture. A visitor could tour the real trading floor, meet real professionals, witness real commerce, and walk away convinced the whole enterprise was sound. The isolation served another purpose too. It kept the circle of knowledge small. Only a handful of loyalists understood that the 17th floor produced nothing but paper. Everyone else saw fragments, a legitimate trade here, a polished statement there, and assumed the fragments added up to something whole. They did not. They added up to a performance, endlessly rehearsed, that was about to face its most persistent audience, the regulators tasked with catching exactly this kind of lie. But before we follow the regulators into their pursuit, we have to understand why they never truly believed the man standing before them could be a criminal. Because Bernie Madoff was not some obscure operator lurking at the edges of the financial world. He was, in the eyes of Wall Street, one of its founding fathers, a figure so woven into the machinery of American markets that suspecting him felt almost like suspecting the market itself. The story begins in 1960 with a young man and a modest amount of savings. Madoff launched his firm with roughly $5,000 he had earned working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems. It was small, hungry, and unglamorous. But Madoff possessed something that would prove more valuable than capital, an instinct for where finance was heading. While the old guard clung to the traditions of the trading floor, with its shouting brokers and handwritten tickets, Madoff looked toward machines. He became an early champion of electronic trading, embracing computerized systems to match buyers and sellers at a time when most of the industry still treated technology with suspicion. His firm helped pioneer the practices that would eventually reshape how stocks were bought and sold across the globe. In doing so, Madoff didn't just build a business. He helped build the modern market's plumbing. His technology and methods influenced the development of the NASDAQ, the electronic exchange that would come to rival the New York Stock Exchange itself. And his involvement went beyond influence. Bernie Madoff served as chairman of the NASDAQ. Let that settle for a moment. The man who was secretly running the largest Ponzi scheme in history had, at one point, presided over one of the most important stock exchanges on the planet. He sat on advisory committees. He testified before regulators. He was consulted by the very institutions responsible for policing fraud. When lawmakers wanted to understand the future of trading, Madoff was in the room, shaping the rules. This was the camouflage, not a disguise made of lies, but one built from genuine achievement. Madoff didn't have to fake his credentials. They were real. He had spent decades earning the trust of the establishment, and that trust became the thickest armor imaginable. Because here is the psychology that protected him. When investigators looked at Bernie Madoff, they saw a legend. They saw a man who had helped write the rulebook. And it simply did not compute that such a person could be hollow at the core. Legitimacy, it turned out, was the perfect place to hide a fraud. The bigger his reputation grew, the safer his secret became. Investors felt it too. To be accepted into Madoff's fund was treated as a privilege, a mark of belonging to an exclusive club. He cultivated an air of scarcity, sometimes turning people away, making them feel lucky to be let in at all. Who questions the man who might refuse your money? Who demands transparency from a legend who seems to be doing you a favor? And then there were the returns. This is where the illusion became almost hypnotic. Year after year, Madoff's fund delivered steady gains, somewhere in the range of 10 to 12%, remarkably consistent, remarkably smooth. When the markets soared, Madoff's investors profited. When the markets crashed, when panic swept through Wall Street and fortunes evaporated, Madoff's investors still saw their statements tick upward, calm and reliable as a heartbeat. Now, anyone with a genuine understanding of financial markets should have recognized the impossibility of this. Real investing is turbulent. Even the greatest fund managers suffer losing years, sharp swings, moments of pain. A return that never falters, that ignores recessions and booms alike, is not the signature of genius. It is the signature of a lie. Real trading leaves footprints of volatility. Madoff's numbers left none. But that impossibility was read backwards. Instead of asking how he could be so consistent, most concluded that he simply must be brilliant, that he had cracked some secret code the rest of the market couldn't see. The very evidence that should have exposed him became, in the minds of his admirers, proof of his mastery. And that misreading, repeated by thousands of intelligent people, is what allowed the machine on the 17th floor to keep running, right past the investigators who came knocking. There was one man, however, who read the numbers correctly, and he did it almost instantly. His name was Harry Markopolos, a financial analyst working in Boston for a rival investment firm. In the year 2000, his bosses handed him a simple assignment. A competitor named Bernie Madoff was posting extraordinary returns, and they wanted Markopolos to reverse engineer the strategy, to figure out how Madoff did it, and then replicate it. It should have been a routine task. Instead, it became an obsession that would consume nearly a decade of his life. Markopolos sat down with Madoff's reported performance figures and began to work through the mathematics. He did not need days. He did not need weeks. Within minutes, he later said, he knew something was catastrophically wrong. Within 4 hours, he was certain. The numbers, quite simply, could not exist in the real world. They described a line that climbed steadily upward, year after year, almost never dipping. A pattern no legitimate trader on earth could produce. To a man who understood the language of markets, it wasn't the signature of genius. It was the signature of fraud. Madoff claimed to use a strategy called a split-strike conversion. In principle, it involved buying a basket of stocks while simultaneously using options to cushion against losses and cap gains. It was a real technique, used by real funds. But Markopolos understood exactly what such a strategy could and could not deliver. Done properly, it would still track the ups and downs of the broader market. It would have losing months. It would stumble when stocks crashed. Madoff's version did none of that. It sailed through downturns untouched, delivering smooth, gentle profits in seasons when everyone else bled. The strategy Madoff described could not physically generate the results Madoff reported. The two things were mathematically incompatible. Then Markopolos looked at the options. For the split-strike strategy to work at the scale Madoff operated, he would need to buy an enormous volume of index options, contracts to hedge billions of dollars in positions. So Markopolos checked the actual size of that options market. The total volume of contracts that existed simply wasn't large enough. Madoff, to trade the way he claimed, would have needed more options than the entire market contained. It was as if a man claimed to fill a swimming pool from a garden hose that produced only a trickle. The physical supply did not match the story, and there were other cracks. Madoff's fund, one of the largest pools of money in the world, was audited not by a major accounting firm, but by a tiny, obscure operation working out of a modest storefront office, staffed by barely a handful of people. A one-man shop, effectively, signing off on tens of billions of dollars. No legitimate enterprise of that size would ever accept such an arrangement. It was a glaring signal that the books were never meant to be seen. Armed with all of this, Markopolos went to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He submitted his first complaint in 2000. Then again in 2001. He kept refining his case, adding detail, sharpening his arguments. In 2005, he delivered his most damning document yet, a lengthy, meticulous memo whose very title accused the world's largest hedge fund of being a fraud. Inside, he laid out roughly 24 red flags, walking regulators step by step through the impossibility of it all. He didn't ask them to trust his instincts. He handed them the math. And the SEC did not act. This is where the story turns from tragedy into something closer to a scandal within a scandal. It was not that no one warned the regulators. It was that they were warned repeatedly, specifically, incredibly, by a qualified expert who had done their work for them. The warnings landed on desks and went nowhere. Markopolos grew increasingly frustrated, increasingly fearful. He worried the powerful man he was accusing might have him silenced. He began checking his car, watching over his shoulder, convinced that exposing Madoff could cost him his life. For years, he carried a truth that no one in authority was willing to believe. And with every quarter that passed, the fabricated statements kept flowing, and the machine kept swallowing more money. The Securities and Exchange Commission was not blind to Bernie Madoff. That is what makes this part of the story so difficult to accept. Over the course of roughly 16 years, the agency opened multiple examinations and investigations touching his operation. Investigators sat across from him. They asked questions. They requested documents. And each time, they walked away without pulling the single thread that would have unraveled everything. To understand how he survived that scrutiny, you have to understand the architecture of the deception and the architecture of the agency chasing it. The SEC was divided into separate branches that did not communicate well. The examiners who inspected broker-dealers operated in one lane. The enforcement staff who investigated fraud operated in another. Madoff understood this division intimately. He had spent decades on Wall Street. He had served in industry leadership roles, helped shape the very market structures the regulators policed. When examiners came to his office, they weren't questioning an obscure outsider. They were questioning a man many of them regarded as an elder statesman of the securities world. He used that status like a weapon. When junior examiners arrived, often young, sometimes inexperienced, Madoff would drop names. He spoke casually of his connections, his positions, his relationships inside the industry, and even inside regulatory circles. To a 20-something investigator making a modest government salary, being lectured by a Wall Street legend was intimidating by design. He answered questions with the confidence of a man who had nothing to hide, and when he sensed doubt, he leaned on his reputation until the doubt receded. Then there were the documents. When the SEC asked to see trading records, account statements, confirmations, Madoff produced them. Quickly, cleanly, professionally formatted. The problem was that every one of them was fabricated. His operation ran a back office whose entire purpose was to manufacture paperwork that told the story he wanted told. Statements were generated to match whatever narrative the examiners were testing. If they wanted to see trades, trades appeared on paper, trades that had never happened. Because the examiners took those documents at face value, they never made the one move that would have exposed him. That move was simple. Madoff claimed to be executing enormous volumes of trades through the market. Every real trade leaves a footprint at a central clearinghouse. A single phone call, a single subpoena to the depository trust company, would have revealed that the trades didn't exist. The securities he claimed to hold were never there. No one made that call for years. The proof was subpoena-able, sitting in plain reach, and it went unrequested. There were other warning signs that should have alarmed anyone who looked. The custody and clearing arrangements were kept inside his own firm, denying independent verification. And the accounting. A fund managing billions of dollars was audited by a tiny operation, a storefront practice with a handful of people working out of a small suburban office. No legitimate institution managing that kind of money used an auditor that small. It was a structural impossibility hiding in plain sight, and it raised no alarm loud enough to act on. Even the trading floor itself was, in effect, a stage. The legitimate market-making side of the business was real and visible. The investment advisory operation, the actual Ponzi engine, was walled off on a separate floor, secretive, restricted, running numbers that traced back not to markets but to a program producing fiction. Visitors saw a functioning firm. They did not see the machine underneath. When it all collapsed, the SEC's own Inspector General launched an investigation into how the agency had failed. The findings were damning. The report concluded that the SEC had received credible, specific complaints over many years. It concluded that investigators had gathered enough information to detect the fraud on multiple occasions. It described inexperienced staff, incompetent examinations, inquiries that were narrowly framed and quickly abandoned. The verdict was not that Madoff was uncatchable. The verdict was that he was catchable, repeatedly, and that the people charged with catching him never followed through. He had studied the watchdog, and he had learned exactly where it wasn't looking. For years, the machine had run on a simple principle. As long as more money flowed in than flowed out, the illusion held. New deposits paid the fictional returns of older clients. The books balanced because Madoff wrote them himself. But every scheme built on incoming cash carries a fatal vulnerability, and in the autumn of 2008, that vulnerability found him. The global financial system was collapsing. Banks were failing, markets were plunging, and investors everywhere were scrambling for anything they could liquidate. Madoff's clients were no different. They came to him not because they suspected fraud, but because they needed cash to cover losses elsewhere. And when they came in numbers he could not survive. Requests for withdrawals piled up, roughly $7 billion in redemptions. It was money the statements promised. It was money that did not exist. There was no portfolio to sell, no securities to unwind, nothing to hand back but paper and lies. The tide had turned, and there was nothing left underneath. In early December, Madoff called his two sons, Mark and Andrew, into a conversation that would end everything. They worked in the firm's legitimate trading operation on a different floor, walled off from the fabrication below. According to their account, he told them the truth for the first time. The investment advisory business was a fraud. It had always been a fraud. He said it was, in his words, one big lie. He estimated the damage at around $50 billion, a figure that would eventually climb higher as investigators traced the fictional balances. He spoke of turning himself in, but first, he said, he wanted to distribute what remained to family and employees. His sons did not wait. They contacted their lawyer, and their lawyer contacted federal authorities. On December 11, 2008, agents arrived at Madoff's Manhattan apartment. He confessed with little resistance. The most successful financial fraud in history ended not with a dramatic chase, but with a quiet arrest in an apartment high above the city he had deceived. When investigators finally opened the doors of the 17th floor, they found the truth laid bare. No trades, no securities, no hidden accounts holding billions in real assets. Only the machinery of deception, the old computers, the false statements, the manufactured history stretching back decades. The trading that clients believed had made them wealthy had never happened. Every confirmation slip, every quarterly report, every carefully printed statement had been fiction. In March 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal counts. He offered no defense, no trial, no attempt to shift the blame. In June, a federal judge sentenced him to 150 years in prison, the maximum, and a symbolic message that the court intended him to die behind bars. He was ordered to forfeit assets totaling roughly $170 billion, a figure representing the total that had moved through the fraud over its lifetime. But the numbers concealed a crucial distinction. On paper, investors believed they had lost about $65 billion, the fictional value of accounts that had grown through invented returns. The actual cash that people had handed over and never recovered was closer to $20 billion. Both figures described catastrophe. One measured a fantasy erased. The other measured real savings, real futures, gone. And behind every number were people. Charities that had trusted Madoff were forced to close their doors, their endowments vaporized. Retirees who had placed their life savings with a man everyone respected found themselves, in their final years, with nothing. Feeder funds that had funneled billions to him collapsed, taking their own investors down with them. The wreckage spread across continents, touching universities, foundations, families, and individuals who had never even heard his name but had trusted the funds that fed him. The human cost reached into Madoff's own family. In December 2010, exactly 2 years after the arrest, his son Mark took his own life. The fraud that had begun as a lie told to strangers had, in the end, consumed the people closest to it. Bernie Madoff died in prison in 2021. But the questions he left behind, about trust, about oversight, about how a watchdog can look directly at fraud and fail to see it, remain unresolved. He didn't defeat the system. The system simply never looked hard enough.